Right. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is what happens when you give the guests a glass of wine before the session. But I think it's going to liven things up as well tonight. We want this to be a fun evening, although of course it is a serious debate. My name is Axel Threlfall. Delighted to see so many here. Lots of familiar faces as well. This, of course, is the second event in the second series of our legal debate program. You know, on my tube journey in this morning, as I was poring over the fifth Brexit article in as many pages in my paper, I was wondering whether I should start this evening with an apology. I'm sure there are a very few in this room who don't feel inundated with facts, figures, and stats being thrown at them from both sides of this debate. News pieces, opinion pieces, political comment, economist comment, the view of industry, of civil society, dossiers of risks, dossiers of benefits, the list goes on. But the room is full, and that speaks volumes, I think, as we approach referendum day. It speaks to the importance and the far-reaching implications of this debate. It speaks, I think, to the confusion still felt by many of you, and to the fact that many of you are perhaps still undecided and open to be won over with intelligent argument. And that, of course, makes for an excellent evening when we combine that with a little bit of red and white wine. I think the debate format injects a little bit of friction, injects a little bit of competition into proceedings. It's also a bit of fun, as it means you get to vote on who you think has argued their case more convincingly. Let me quickly run you through the voting. You're going to vote before, and then you're going to vote at the end, and we're going to see to what extent you've been swayed. So do the pre-debate vote now. You can do it via the app. Details are up on the screen. Hopefully you can read that okay. Select the event, select the main session starting at 6:30 and cast your vote. Or you can text it, legal debate to the number on the screen there. Then text once more with yes, no, or undecided, and I'll share those results with you before we start. As usual, my opinion as the host and the timekeeper is not important. It's the job very much of our speakers to try and win you over this evening. But tonight especially, I think the less I say on the subject, the better. It's not an excuse to avoid trawling through the reams of information and putting together a comprehensive introduction for you. It's more the voice of someone who's required by his employer to remain totally impartial on this subject, that has emotions, including my own, running extremely high. That said, I did pull out a little bit of data. Let me give you the latest polling data, then we'll get to our speakers. Ipsos Mori today has the Remains in Europe ahead by 10 points, 49 to 39 now. A TNS poll shows support for the in-camp rising to 38%, the outs on 34. The latest YouGov poll, I think that was yesterday, has the in-camp leading the outs 40 to 39. Of course, our motion refers specifically to bankers and lawyers. There's been much written on the economic impact and how an exit would change the banking landscape in the UK. No doubt we'll hear about that this evening. Latest polls from the legal profession point to a pretty strong lead for the Remain contingent. Lawyers in for Britain, I think there are about 300 of them now, are pitched against Lawyers for Britain, represented here this evening by Eric. How many of you are there now? We have, I think, about 300. Okay, so pretty much the same. So that's a nice even match. They support, of course, a separation from Europe. Enough from me. Would a Brexit be bad news for London's bankers and lawyers? Let's hear from the panelists. As usual, we're going to do 2 for, 2 against. They'll alternate their opening statements before we open it up to Q&A with you. So do ready some questions, and then we'll have very quick 1.5-minute closing statements before we vote again. Arguing for the motion, I'll quickly introduce the speakers, then I'll do the results of this debate. Arguing for that a Brexit would indeed be bad news for London's bankers and lawyers, Mark Boleat, Chair of the Policy and Resources Committee of the City of London, well placed, of course, to comment on job creation and investment in the city. On the same side is Rhodri Thompson, QC at Matrix Chambers, Senior Silk specialising in competition law and EU law. Arguing against is Eric Phillips, who I just mentioned, on the Committee of Lawyers for Britain, advocating a leave. He's currently with Slaughter and May, though is speaking, he stresses, in a personal capacity this evening, and arguing... I was told I had to say that. And arguing with Eric is Lord Norman Lamont. Lord Lamont will be a familiar face to many here, a cabinet member in the government of Margaret Thatcher and John Major, Chancellor of the Exchequer from 90 to 93. He is the Vice President of the Eurosceptic Bruges Group and has been quoted as saying, quitting the EU is a once-in-a-generation opportunity. Right, let's get you the results of the pre-debate vote. The yeses, so the fours, 68% were on for yeses. Brexit would be bad news for London's bankers and lawyers. The against, I guess no great surprises at this point, but maybe we can shift the dial here. The no's on 17%, the undecided is on 16%, so there is quite a bit to play for over the next hour. As I said, we'll get another chance to vote afterwards. First up, arguing for the motion, Mark Boleat. Mark, you have 8 to 10 uninterrupted minutes from this podium. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chairman. Last week I was doing a similar debate with the Institute of Actuaries, so it's pleasing to have a rather less lively audience tonight. Well, I mean, having seen the results of the poll, I thought the best thing I could do is probably sit down, as there seems only one way from those sort of results. But I better make my speech. Actually, I really don't care whether Brexit would be bad news for bankers, and I care even less whether it would be bad news for lawyers. But I do care about jobs in London and throughout the country, and I do care about London, the world's greatest and most international city and the financial centre of Europe. London has been stunningly successful in the last 30 years. For a variety of reasons, including bad decisions by our good friends in France and in the US in particular. It is the place where people want to do business. Access to the European markets is a factor explaining this. Unimportant for many institutions, of some importance for some, and of crucial importance for others, especially those that trade throughout the European Union on the basis of a single licence and the passporting arrangements. From the debates I've had so far, it seems many people simply do not understand passporting and do not understand the difference between a free trade area and a single market. The point is that within the European Union, a financial institution authorised and regulated in one country can operate throughout the whole of the European Union without the need to be authorised and regulated in other countries. And as a result of this, we now have a fantastic financial services industry in London. UK-headquartered firms account for only a limited proportion of EU business done out of London. The city relies extensively for its business on US, Swiss, German, French, Chinese-owned firms, along with others from the rest of the world. Currently, 250 foreign banks operate in London. Over 200 foreign law firms have offices in London and across the UK. There are 75 banks in London from other EU countries with over £1 trillion of assets, or 17% of total bank assets in the UK. Half of all European headquarters of non-EU firms are based in the UK. UBS, Credit Suisse, Deutsche Bank, BNP are among the European banks that run a lot of their European investment banking business from London. The Lloyd's market is surely one of the great institutions of the city. The chairman of Lloyd's has written to the Lloyd's market in the following terms. The Council of Lloyd's and the Franchise Board have carefully considered the question of EU membership in the context of the interests of the Lloyd's market. We have unanimously concluded that the best outcome is for the UK to remain a member of the EU. He pointed to the passporting rights, and he concluded membership of the EU will be a crucial element in London being able to retain and reinforce its preeminent status as a global hub for insurance and reinsurance. Let's look at another city institution not far from here, JP Morgan. JP Morgan's got something over 16,000 staff serving the European Union in the European Union. 15,000 of them are in the United Kingdom, the majority in London, but many in Bournemouth and Glasgow. And to quote the Chief Executive, Jamie Dimon, if we can't passport out of the UK, we would have to set up different operations in Europe. Now, some might say this isn't a problem, and for JP Morgan, they could do it, albeit at some cost. But what would be lost would be jobs in London, in Bournemouth, and in Glasgow. And not just bankers, who, as you gather, I care little about, but other jobs not only within the company, but in suppliers large and small. So what would Brexit mean? Well, that depends on the end result. And already we know we have uncertainty affecting decisions being taken today. Michael Gove's speech yesterday sets out what the Leave campaign wants: a free trade option, stretching from Iceland to the Russian border and without being subject to EU regulation, the Albanian option as it's become known. So not the single market. He's saying not the single market. So no passporting. So reluctantly, if that was the case, businesses now in London and Glasgow and Bournemouth and Leeds and Manchester and Belfast and every other city, they would, over time, not out of spite, but over time, some of those jobs would shift to places where they could do business. The cost to them is manageable, but it would be lost jobs and lost tax revenue to Britain. So what about the upside? Freedom from Brussels red tape. When I ask the question such as, I'm generally met with silence. I previously ran the Association of Labour Providers, or Gangmasters. Good training for being chairman of the City of London Policy and Resources Committee. These are the people who bring in the workers from Poland and Romania and Bulgaria, probably 800,000 or more. And when the DTI asked me for a list of all of the nasty EU regulations that were affecting their business, I went through everything I'd sent them for years and found nothing. What I did find is British policy measures like the administration of the national minimum wage and the accession states worker registration scheme. The working time directive was a doddle. You get an opt-out on day one, and even the agency workers directive we got round in about 10 minutes flat. So what is this regulation we're going to be freed from? In financial services, some regulation is homegrown, some is international, done at G20 level, which the former Chancellor is well aware of, and some is EU regulation that Britain would not otherwise do. But there is no expectation in the financial services industry that in the event of Brexit we would have lighter touch regulation. You will all recall the Chancellor's famous the Prime Minister's veto in December 2011, when he vetoed a European Union treaty. Let me quote you what he said in the House of Commons on one of the reasons for vetoing the treaty. To those who say we are trying to go soft on the banks, nothing can be further from the truth. One of the things we wanted was to make sure we could go further than European rules in regulating the banks. And much the same applies to the rest of the financial services industry. Other homegrown and onerous regulation includes the senior managers regime, the clawback rules for bankers' remuneration, the toughest in the world, the ring fencing of retail banking, and generally the intrusive nature of FCA regulation. Yes, I hear complaints about financial regulation, but they are predominantly complaints about the Financial Conduct Authority, not about the European Union. And so, membership of the European Union has been crucial to London's success as Europe's financial centre, creating jobs and tax revenue for the whole country. Leaving the EU in practice means leaving the single market, given that the Leave movement will not accept free movement of labour or a single rulebook. It means giving up substantial advantages and gaining little reward for doing so. It would lead to a significant erosion of London's position as a global financial centre and the financial centre for Europe.
You've got about a minute.
There is not one financial trade association which has expressed the view that Britain would be better off leaving. They range from neutrality to support for remaining. The representatives of major city institutions such as Lloyd's of London, the London Stock Exchange, Aviva, Goldman Sachs, HSBC, Barclays, Prudential, RSA, Standard Life and Santander have given the views of their institutions, not their personal views that Britain should remain a member. Not one large financial institution has expressed the view that Britain is better off out. Brexit would be bad for the city. It would be bad for London, and it would be bad for jobs throughout the UK. And it would mean significantly less tax revenue, which helps underpin so many of the public services we rely on. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. Next up, arguing against, Eric Phillips, Lawyers for Britain. Eric, you've got a few undecideds to win over, maybe some of the againsts as well. Your 8 to 10 minutes starts right now.
I'd like to thank Thomson Reuters for inviting me to argue against this evening's motion, and also my firm for agreeing to my participation. As an unashamed globalist, and as a committed free marketeer, I am keen to argue the positive case for London's bankers and lawyers outside the European Union. There is, of course, nothing inherently European about financial or legal services. Capital and knowledge, the tools of our trade, should know no borders. They both pass with a click of a mouse from London to Paris to Frankfurt to New York to Singapore in an instant. For lawyers working from London, there is no expectation that our client is in the UK or in the European Union. We are, of course, happy to take instructions from anywhere in the world within reason. Whether you are a lender or whether you are a borrower, your primary concern is not the nationality of your counterparty, but creditworthiness, cost of capital, and your appetite for risk and reward. The global nature of today's financial and professional services industries continue to represent an incredible opportunity for London, one of the world's few truly global cities, equipped to remain a global financial centre over the coming decades. To quote the current Chancellor of the Exchequer, the City of London is not, as some of our continental friends kid themselves, in competition with Paris and Frankfurt. It is in competition with places like Hong Kong, Singapore, and New York. We might reflect on this fact. Why is it that London, Hong Kong, Singapore, and New York are the global financial centres? And why is it that Paris, Frankfurt, Madrid, and Milan are not? It is not just that the former all share the English language, the international language of finance, though that is important. It is also that the former are all common law jurisdictions, where courts are bound to follow precedent, allowing lawyers to advise with a high degree of certainty and giving market participants the fullest confidence in the enforceability of their contractual rights. London also has the advantage of time zone, a concentration of professional services firms, some 750,000 talented individuals from all over the world working in the city, more than the entire population of Frankfurt. London also benefits from a government committed to a regulatory environment that supports financial services, while our continental counterparties have been working on a financial transactions tax that their own evidence suggests will reduce market activity. All of these things we will retain outside the European Union. For London, global financial interconnectivity represents not just an opportunity, but also a challenge, given that financial and professional services make up such a large part of our economy. Because of the global nature of the financial system, it does not make sense for regulatory standards to be British or European, but to be global. And that is increasingly happening, with a global policy agenda in financial services regulation being driven by the G20, the Financial Stability Board, and by international standard settings bodies. Let us consider, for example, the requirements for bank capital. These are agreed globally by the Basel Committee on Banking Supervision, and happily, we in the UK are influential in setting these standards. Unfortunately, the UK does not have the power to implement these standards in the UK in the way that we would like to do so, for that is a competence of the European Union. The EU's implementation of the Basel Bank Capital Standards, the Capital Requirements Directive, include some suboptimal provisions for the United Kingdom. Firstly, the cap on bankers' bonuses. There is nothing in the global bank capital standards on bankers' bonuses. This was an initiative of the European Parliament. In the Council of Ministers, during the EU legislative process, George Osborne argued that the cap would be harmful to the City of London and have the perverse effect of driving up base salaries and adding rigidity to the banking system, but he was in a minority of one and outvoted. The Bank of England has since noted that the cap has undesirable side effects for financial stability, limiting the scope for remuneration to be clawed back. Secondly, there is the question of the technical detail of bank capital itself. The global bank capital standards are, rightly, a set of minimum standards, not a set of maximum standards, allowing countries to go above and beyond those minimum standards where necessary for them. The Bank of England has argued, in the context of its financial stability objective and EU law, that as host to a large internationally integrated financial sector, the UK may need to go further and adopt tighter regulatory standards than are appropriate for smaller, domestic-focused financial systems. However, because the Capital Requirements Directive is largely a maximum harmonisation measure, the ability of the UK government and UK authorities to tighten regulatory standards is limited. Were we to leave the EU, we would, of course, continue to commit to global minimum standards in bank capital and other areas and contribute to the setting of these, just as we do now. But unlike now, we would be able to tailor the legislation implementing those standards to the specific needs of our economy, liberalising in some areas, such as bankers' bonuses, and tightening them in others, such as capital requirements, without being held back by whatever is politically desirable in those parts of the EU that do not have financial services sectors like we do. The EU single market, as Mark Boleat has magnificently exposed, allows financial services firms within the EU to take advantage of passporting within an array of financial services legislation, without going through further regulatory approvals in host member states. Each of those pieces of legislation contains within it equivalent regimes for countries outside the EU, though each of these equivalent regimes is somewhat restrictive, and the Remain campaign is correct to point out that it is those restrictive regimes that we would be subject to in respect of our EU trade were we to leave the EU. But those restrictive equivalence regimes reflect an EU that primarily looks inwards rather than outwards and is unduly protectionist towards financial services.
You've got about 1 minute.
While this protectionist tendency may be acceptable to certain countries without significant financial services industries or with protectionist tendencies, it should not be acceptable to a London that is interested in the opportunities of global free trade and free markets. Inside the EU, the UK has not been able to get the EU to agree to free trade agreements with other parts of the world covering financial services to the extent that we would like. Outside the EU, the UK has the option to seek comprehensive free trade agreements with as much of the rest of the world as possible, and in any event, we could and we should unilaterally allow financial services firms in the rest of the world and in the EU to access the UK's markets, provided that they meet global minimum standards. When considering leaving or remaining, we should remember that neither remain nor leave is a status quo. As anyone who works in financial services can tell you, the only certainty is change and continued uncertainty. Let us consider, for example, Capital Markets Union. It is important to realise that the UK and the Eurozone are already thinking about this in completely different ways. In Monday's report from the Treasury, which welcomed Capital Markets Union, it said, a Capital Markets Union will benefit all 28 member states, but with a particular benefit to the UK, given its large and sophisticated financial sector.
Have to think about wrapping up now.
Differently, the Five Presidents report stated that the Capital Markets Union applies to all 28 member states, but is particularly relevant to the euro area. Those two things cannot both be true. To be a successful global financial centre, what is required is strong, fair, and commercial legal regulatory environment and an openness to global trade. These are things that are entirely within our gift if we leave the EU, but within the EU's gift if we remain.
Thank you very much indeed, Eric. I might have to deduct a minute from Lord Lamont's time for that. Yeah, he was hassling me about the time as well through that. So, right, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Eric. Rhodri Thompson is arguing for the motion together with Mark Boleat. Rhodri, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I'm here in a personal capacity, but also on behalf of Lawyers In for Britain, who has produced this report. Just to clarify, I think there are about 300 people who've signed up to the report, but there are obviously quite a lot of other people who, for whatever reason, didn't want to put their head above the parapet to that extent. Insofar as I understood what Eric was saying, I think if you can bear to read any more stuff, there's an excellent Bank of England account of the EU and financial services, which deals with a lot of these regulatory issues in a considerable amount of detail. We deal with it in some detail here, drawing on the Bank of England report. And we haven't mentioned it so far, but there's also, of course, the famous or infamous settlement agreement. And insofar as there's a concern about the balance between the UK and the other member states, and in particular the Eurozone, then I think that is undoubtedly the most important part of the settlement agreement. And the point that would be most lost if the day after a Brexit, those arrangements simply went up in smoke and the Eurozone was unconstrained in the way it went. And that I think, would be a major loss. Turning to my theme, in some extent I could be conflicted in that I think when the Lawyers In for Britain group was identified, there was a question raised, and it was also raised in the Times this morning, about whether lawyers, and in particular this morning competition lawyers, might not do well out of the chaos that would follow from a Brexit. And I think the answer that was given then, and I could give again now, is that doctors might do well from the bubonic plague, but probably only in the short term. The effect of leaving the EU would certainly generate some complicated legal problems, but as Marcus said, the important question is the overall effect on the UK economy. That's the real question tonight, not only for London, but for the UK as a whole. And I'll address 3 points: the value of the single market, the freedom to provide services, and then financial and legal services, though I may, of course, run out of time. The value of the single market, and here I think we may be helped, we can cut to the chase with a quote from a familiar face on your televisions. We are committed to playing a leading role in the European Union in order to advance our national interest. The single market is one of the greatest forces for prosperity the continent's ever known, and that's why we'll continue to push an ambitious programme of deepening the single market while seeking to reduce unnecessary burdens in EU legislation. And that was William Hague, the Foreign Secretary, in July 2012, launching what came to be called the Balance of Competences Review. You might expect Lord Lamont, as a former Tory Chancellor, to agree not only with William Hague, but also with all 4 Prime Ministers since 1990, and indeed Lady Thatcher, who campaigned strongly both for UK membership and for the internal market programme, and also with the present Tory Chancellor, the G20, the IMF, the World Bank, the OECD, HM Treasury, and the Bank of England, and the specific advice of our closest and most powerful ally, the USA. Instead, I understand he's on the other side, although of course he's always welcome to change. I'm not sure if he endorses what has been unflatteringly but essentially accurately been described as the utopian rubbish put out by Michael Gove yesterday, or with the unpromising and unedifying contributions of the Mayor of London, calling the President of the USA a hypocrite, describing the EU as crap, and dismissing his opponent's arguments by using expressions such as baloney, knickers, and bollocks, rather than by advancing any sensible arguments. As has become increasingly obvious this week, the Leave campaign needs to answer two critical issues. Does it favour pursuit of sovereignty, control of immigration, and refusal to contribute to the EU budget as its key objectives, even if that leads to substantial loss of access to the single market? This might reasonably be called the Turkish or Russian option. It seems to be the approach favoured by UKIP and Nigel Farage, and now apparently Michael Gove. You might call it the rough approach. Or does it favour a smooth approach? And I think if you watched Newsnight on Monday, you might remember Daniel Hannan would be a good example of the smooth approach. Retention of the benefits of the single market access so far as possible, even if that means that the UK is bound to accept its rules, to contribute to its costs, to abandon its current considerable influence over the content of those rules, to abandon the rights of the UK and its businesses to enforce them in other member states, and most probably to give up its current extensive opt-outs from those rules as the price of re-entry. This could be called the Norwegian or Swiss option. Neither of these options is at all credible, but it's still unclear even what the Leave campaign is proposing, let alone whether it could be achieved as an alternative to the current arrangements. Turning to the freedom to provide services, the rights to establish service businesses in other member states and to provide cross-border services within the EU are two of the elements of the single market that are most valuable to UK businesses. They are based, contrary to the popular understanding, on a major deregulation agenda. First of all, mutual recognition of national authorisations between member states, reductions to the minimum of national authorisation requirements, non-discrimination on grounds of nationality, and effective and enforceable rights of appeal where authorisation is refused or where unfair conditions are imposed. These are very important legal rights on which our service industries rely heavily in expanding their businesses throughout the EU. In financial services, the solution's been called passporting, but similar issues arise across the services sector. The need to protect our vital interests in relation to the supply of services, which is about 80% of our economy, and we're the market leader throughout the EU, appears to have passed the Leave campaign by almost completely. But it was clearly identified by the Foreign Secretary, Philip Hammond, in his evidence to the EU Select Committee on the 26th of January. I agree very much that we want to see completion of the single market in services, financial services in particular. Britain is the country with the largest services sector in the European Union, so it's very much to our advantage to be in a European Union that has a single market in services as well as in goods. To date, Leave campaigners have responded to criticisms of the lack of clarity about what they're seeking to achieve by saying, and I think Chris Grayling is probably the most notable example, that the Germans and the French wish to sell washing machines and cheese to the UK so that they'll be happy to reach a new trading arrangement with the EU. However, the desire to sell us washing machines and cheese would certainly not guarantee the freedom to provide services, where we currently enjoy a large trade surplus. Certainly not if we sought to impose discriminatory quotas or visas on EU nationals wishing to enter the UK. One might compare Mexico or Canada trying to negotiate a favourable trade deal with the USA while at the same time restricting the rights of Americans to enter their country. Finally, legal and financial services. These are two economic sectors where, together with the USA, the UK leads the world, where London is still the international financial centre of the world. Mark has already explained the commercial reality of the situation for the city if the UK were to cease to be a member of the EU. So far as the lawyers are concerned, I'd identify four problems. First of all, and the most obvious and commercially significant, harm to the city would be harm to the legal profession, whose most valuable clients are the leading financial institutions and their major customers. Secondly, neither freedom of establishment nor freedom to provide services would be guaranteed to non-members of the EU. They can only be guaranteed by establishment within the EU. Thirdly, the UK is not only the foremost centre for international finance, but also for international dispute resolution. That's underpinned to a substantial degree by common rules on enforcement and jurisdiction within the EU. There's no guarantee that this would remain in place under any revised trading relationship.
You've got a minute from that.
Finally, last but not least of my list, loss of influence over the development of EU law. Just as the Bank of England has considerable input into the form of regulation within the EU, so English lawyers and judges have had a major influence over the development of EU law. that would be lost. We would have no advocates general, we would have no judges in the Court of Justice, we would have no right to appear, we would have no right to intervene, whereas now we can appear in every case before the Court of Justice. That would be a very considerable and specific loss. So far as quantifying all this, just as the Treasury made an attempt to quantify with some criticism during this week, the Law Society commissioned an independent report at the end of 2015 by Oxford Economics, which reached very similar conclusions. They found that providers of legal services would be disproportionately affected by any adverse economic effects resulting from UK departure. They found that the longer-term effects were adverse on all the scenarios they considered plausible, and on the worst-case scenario, they said that UK growth in the legal sector by 2030 could be reduced by 1.7 billion, equivalent to the total turnover of the 4 largest UK firms combined. In summary, leaving the EU would be bad for the UK economy, bad for banks, bad for banking, bad for lawyers, and bad for the law. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Rhodri. Thompson. Finally, arguing against is Lord Norman Lamont. Lord Lamont, you've got the right to reply to various comments in that
Mr. Chairman, I'm getting to the podium as quickly as possible so the time doesn't run out.
Go.
Thank you very much. We agree on that. I've got it here. Mark Boleat is obviously a secret Brexit supporter, because if the rest of the country are persuaded Brexit is bad for bankers, we're going to win overwhelmingly. That I'm sure of. If only you add bad for lawyers as well, bad for estate agents, bad for politicians, then we will get a very, very high vote indeed. For that reason, I think I'm very happy to lose the vote that we're going to have tonight, and I look well on the way to doing that. But that's not actually the argument that I want to pursue tonight, because I'm sure that even lawyers and bankers won't just look at this profound issue simply in terms of their own economic interest. We are all citizens of the country. The political arrangements of our country matter. We need to look at it from the national interest point of view, not just from an economic, but in the wider sense. We heard a lot about bankers, we heard a lot about lawyers, we heard a lot about money. We did not hear once the issue of parliamentary democracy and accountability referred to. Not once. What monetary value do you put on that? I say that because although I'm going to address the questions that have been put, and is obviously the major purpose of the meeting tonight, for me, this is primarily a political question rather than an economic question. I regard the economics of being in or leaving as really pretty evenly balanced and not dramatic on either side. But I regard the politics of remaining in the European Union as full of risks. And I think it is behoven on everybody to think about that. We need to raise our eyes to the wider questions. Helena Morris, the chief executive of Newton Asset Management, has described Britain's relationship with the European Union as being an unnatural one. Why does she say that? I think she's saying that because we joined the EEC, as it originally was, for different reasons for other countries. Germany joined because of its traumatic recent 20th century past, and France also for a troubled narrative. Spain and Portugal and Greece because of the fascist dictatorships that they had and wanting to have the badge of democracy put on them. And the Balkan countries because of the history they had of communist dictatorship. Britain, I think, joined for entirely different reasons, and Britain, with its past history, I think was more comfortable in its skin. I voted in 1975 for Britain to be in the EEC. It's the only time I've ever spoken in favour of Europe in Trafalgar Square alongside Kenneth Clark. I did that. But I believe that what we were joining then, as was promised in the white paper, it said there is no possibility of monetary union. And of course, in the 45 years that has passed since, Europe has profoundly changed. It has an elected parliament, directly elected, which we were told would not happen. It has a single currency. Because of the single currency, it is moving more and more to fiscal integration, which means one European government. When I became Chancellor, I discovered something I'd always been told to regard as just a myth, something we didn't really believe was true, that actually Europe wanted to create a United States of Europe. Europe is a country under construction. You have to decide whether that is what you really want, where we have 8% of the votes in the Parliament and 10% of the votes in the European Council. The question is, what is the alternative economically to the European Union? The alternative is that we will trade with the European Union as other countries trade with the European Union. People talk about access as though this was some massive problem, as though there was some gigantic wall around the European Union. Switzerland exports 5 times as much per capita to the EU as we do, despite not being a member. The United States, much larger economy, but thousands of miles away, exports more than we do to the European Union. It has no say in the rules. He says, services. Even in services, they export very nearly as much as we do. Let me just name a few things, because studies have been done of legislation that, were it left to the UK, we might not have adopted on our own initiative. The bankers' bonuses ban, a very stupid law trying to regulate remuneration by law, which distorts, as everybody in this room knows, basic salaries. The ban on short selling. Why did that happen? Because of hostility in the European Parliament, the loathing for Anglo-Saxon capitalism, a nonsensical measure. The financial transactions tax, which is likely to be carried out by a smaller group of countries than the whole of the EU under the enhanced cooperation procedure. But if it is, and when it happens, and countries have indicated they want to go ahead as a smaller group, it will apply to transactions in London that originate in the EU, and if Britain is in the EU, the tax will be levied on transactions in London, but not if those transactions go to Singapore. Of course, the city gains from London, but in the quotation that Eric quoted from George Osborne, the City of London is a global financial capital. Its business in the rest of the world is also going to grow. For the insurance industry, Asia and America matter more than Europe. Investors in the stock market, there are more United States investors than there are European ones. The City of London has 30% of global foreign exchange transactions. It has over 40% of over-the-counter interest rate derivative transactions as well. The human capital is here, and it's not very easy. I don't believe all those foreign exchange traders are suddenly going to go off and live in Frankfurt. Tell me another. I really don't believe it. Passporting, the issue that Mark came out with. Well, some of the legislation that exists applying to financial services, like the AIFMD, which is that under which I think most hedge funds and private equities operate, the AIFMD does have provision for third parties outside the EU to be licensed and to allow passporting. And I'm told, though Mark will know more about this than I do, that that is likely to happen. I can't remember whether it's Guernsey or Jersey, but also to Hong Kong. UCITS. If you take UCITS, if a fund is structured according to the UCITS requirements, it's quite difficult to stop it being sold within the EU, provided it is domiciled in Luxembourg, even if it is advised by a UK company. You might have to have some sort of brass plate in between, but it's very, very difficult if you observe the principle of the mobility of capital actually to stop people buying investment products in and from and outside the EU. The Swiss banks, well, some Swiss institutions, some types of insurance have been allowed to passport. Swiss banks don't seem to have too much trouble. They're not allowed to passport. They do have to incorporate, but it doesn't seem to have totally put them at a massive disadvantage. Yes, Europe The single market for financial services does matter. But we have a surplus there, as Mark said. We also have a surplus with the rest of the world. And the real threat to the City of London is from excessive regulation, becoming uncompetitive globally by having to observe too much financial regulation.
Just over a minute.
Mr. Chairman, just over a minute. I would end simply by saying there is no status quo either in staying in or getting out. The world is going to change whether you're in or out. The European Union has changed profoundly from how it was 45 years ago. We only get occasionally a chance to let our voice be heard on this. But bear in mind, 10% of the votes in the European Council, 8% of the votes in the European Parliament. I would rather have a situation where we had lawmakers that we could hold accountable, lawmakers that we could dismiss. I would like to get our country back. Thank you very much.
Right. Thank you very much to all of our speakers. Those were the uninterrupted statements. We do have a few minutes now for you to challenge what you've heard. Just a reminder of the pre-debate result, about 67 for, about 17 against, and there are some undecideds, about 15%. I don't know if that maths adds up exactly, but so let's hear some questions from you, and then we'll hear the closing statements as well. Any questions, please, from the audience? There must be plenty, surely. Yeah, gentleman right here. If you just wait for the microphone, tell us who you are and where you're from as well, please.
How much you are?
Jonathan Cornthwaite from Wedlake Bell. I'd like to ask...
Wedlake Bell.
Yes.
You'll have to repeat the questions.
Okay. Could I ask Thomson Reuters why, in framing the wording for the motion, they chose a loaded and a leading question rather than an open question?
I'm not part of this debating panel. As I said, I'm not allowed to show my stripes, so I can't answer that. You have to speak to the organisers about that. But tell me, who else thinks it's a loaded leading question here? Okay.
I agree with Norman.
You do?
Not only I thought Bankers for Brussels is not a slogan I would like, and following Eric's point, to go to the country with the platform, when we leave the EU, we can increase bankers' bonuses. It's not, even though it's a stupid measure, isn't going to get many votes.
It's up to really our parliament to decide whether bankers have bonuses or not. There may be some people in this room that don't like it. There may be others that do like it.
Actually,
we can decide it in a democratic way.
It's nothing to do with Parliament. It's done by a regulator. It's not Parliament.
That's not right. It originated from the European
European
Parliament.
No, sorry.
The measure did.
If it was in Britain, it would not be done by Parliament. The clawback rules are done by a regulator, not by Parliament.
But it's ultimately under parliamentary oversight because it's Parliament that gives power to that regulator.
It gives power and then it leaves it to the regulator. Come on, half of you are in this business, sure.
However, some political parties might have a political platform to remove them, and some others might not have that platform. So it would ultimately be a democratic decision.
Let's have another question. And please don't direct the question at me. You've got these four here.
Having watched the Nick Robinson programme last night and last week, one could reach the conclusion that for the last 40 years we've either been lied to by our own politicians, or maybe it's just the world hasn't turned out as everybody thought. The Remain campaign is making a big play that better to stay in because we've got a degree of certainty. I'd like to ask the panel whether they think that certainty is actually justified.
Rhodri.
Well, I mean, in terms of who's been lied to and what about, I think probably both sides. Certainly, if the suggestion is that the political elites, as it were, have painted too rosy a picture of the EU and our relationship to it, I think that's been more than compensated by the barrage in the press of somewhat misleading stories of what the EU is about, not least in terms of regulation, because people talk about the single market, but there's very little explanation of what it actually is. It tends to be come to people's attention when somebody complains that cabbages have to be a certain weight or shape. but they forget that the whole point is to abolish 28 sets of rules about the size of cabbages and compare it with only one, and to eliminate national rules unless they can be justified. And so in terms of misinformation, I think there's a balance on both sides. In terms of the sovereignty and politics of it, which I suspect is what you're really getting at, there's a question to be answered about whether the EU is effectively a sort of straitjacket and that we would recover, in Michael Gove's immortal phrase, our mojo, if we left the EU, or whether it isn't rather indicative that the pound has dropped 10% even on the suspicion as far leaving the EU, and the position is rather, as John Major says, that the EU acts as a form of megaphone for the UK, that we are an influential voice within one of the three global players in the world, and that is actually a very good place for the UK to be, and we could make a lot more of it if we were more positive about it.
Okay. Rhodri, thank you. Anyone else want to have a go on that? Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, I was going to say that there is, of course, uncertainty, and there are, of course, people on both sides of the debate that are making ridiculous claims. However, uncertainty itself is not really a bad thing. We have uncertainty before every general election, and yet we accept that elections must take place. Of course, we don't know how the EU will respond when we vote to leave. It may be that they are open to trade with us in a rational way, and that would be in their rational interest. Or it may be that in a fit of pique, they put up all kinds of barriers, as many as they possibly can, and we cannot do anything about that. However, what we can do is control our response to it, and as they are putting up barriers, we can reduce barriers at our end and be open to trade with them. The good thing about free trade is that it works unilaterally. It's not like nuclear disarmament, where you both have to disarm. If you reduce barriers yourself, you benefit.
A couple of points. I agree there's uncertainty, whatever happens. I just think the amount of uncertainty, if we choose to leave, is a massive multiple of the uncertainty of remaining. Let's take, one of the big investment banks that collectively employ over 100,000 people. They know at least for the next 10, 20, 30 years, they can operate throughout the whole of the European Union from London. If they leave, the assumption is they can't, because that's what the Leave campaign has said. They do not go along with the single market. So that's pretty big in my view. On free trade, I think, frankly, with respect, that's wrong. We would be in the WTO, and you can't do it unilaterally. That's part of the WTO arrangements. And there would be nothing whatever about fit of pique. We choose to leave the European Union and the single market, having spent a bit of time, frankly, insulting them over the last 10 years, and the words that Boris Johnson used were similar. Frankly, I know even our own Prime Minister and Chancellor have spent years having a go at the European Union, and then we're expecting them, we've left the club, would they kindly let us back in? But by the way, we're not complying with the rules, and we're not paying the fee. Be real. I travel a lot in Europe. I talk to policymakers. They say, you want to be in the European Union, fine. But if you don't expect you're going to get all the benefits, access to our markets, not comply with any of the rules, and by the way, it's free.
All right.
Not even a lawyer can expect that.
I'm not actually expecting that. I am expecting them to put up many barriers. That is likely.
But they're not putting them up. They're there. I mean, we would be leaving. They're not putting up barriers. We're walking out of...
When we meet global minimum standards, they still might not want to trade with us on the basis of those standards. Now, that isn't rational for them, but they may still do it.
Eric, it sounds to me like you're a smooth man, because if you were going to put up barriers to free movement, I don't think that would be welcome from the EU.
I welcome immigration from all over the world.
Go ahead.
Well, the question was in two parts. The first part was the certainty on either side, and I think that was almost the last point I made before your pinger went, that there was no certainty on either side. The Yes campaign continually say, what is your alternative to the EU? I could turn the question round and say, what is the EU going to look like in another 20 years? What will be the position of Turkey in the EU? They've just decided to reconsider fast-tracking Turkish membership. Turkey is to be given visa-free travel as of June. how much fiscal integration is there going to be in the EU in the next few years? What other countries are going to be admitted? There are a whole series of changes in the EU, which could be just as profound as those we've seen in the last few decades. The second question, which I notice neither of my two opponents really addressed, was were people misled? In fact, I think it is quite significant that neither of them have talked about democracy and accountability. They've talked 100% about the economy, tried to narrow it down just to the city as well, but have not addressed at all this question of political unification. And the question that was asked was this because of politicians lying? I don't think in 1975, Harold Wilson, when it was under Harold Wilson that the referendum was held, I don't think for 1 minute he envisaged that Europe would develop like this. And I think he believed the white paper that was published in his name. It is possible, I mean, I try never to use the word lying about people, but perhaps with relation to Sir Edward Heath, who's now dead, I could say that I'm a bit doubtful about exact...
You're going to get another minute and a half to wrap up in a second, and you guys can respond to that and you'll wrap up as well. I want to move to a next question, if you don't mind.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Thank you for the thoughtful arguments on the Brexit side. Some of them I hadn't heard.
Can everyone hear this okay, by the way? Yep.
Thanks. Yeah, they were very useful, thank you. However, the impression I get from both your speeches, actually, is that the bankers of lawyers of London exist in a sort of sinister vacuum, inhabited only by bankers and lawyers. I did not really get any sense of what will happen to the client base that these lawyers and bankers serve when so many companies suddenly face barriers because we leave the single market. There's just not something you address, and I think that's particular. I mean, perhaps for Slaughter and May, who is already ready to be a local firm, that's not a problem. But for most firms that have a cross-border unified presence, surely the fact that the single market will no longer be something we have access
Eric,
to.
you might have to put your Slaughter and May hat on for this one.
I will simply say that all firms are truly global. So there are, my firm, we don't have a big network of offices, though we do have close relationships with law firms all over the world, and other big law firms based in the city, they have their own network of offices which are global. And of course, we have clients all over the world. Now, there may be some impacts on some of those clients. Some of our clients have publicly come out for Remain, others publicly for Leave, and they will have issues facing them. But I suppose what we were trying to do was specifically answer the actual question, but I can come and speak to you afterwards.
All right. You can do that over a glass of wine. Okay, let's have another question. Yeah, question in the back there. Go ahead.
Simon Pudge from Allied Irish Bank. It seems the deal on the table is basically, if you want free trade, which benefits everybody, you have to pay £10 billion a year and accept unlimited immigration. It sounds like a funny deal.
Mark, do you want to address
So we're not talking free trade, we're talking single market. There is a difference. And it's clear that this is not
And this is, you say, a mistake that Michael Gove made yesterday.
Well, no, he didn't make a mistake. I mean, he was very clear. He was talking about, the free trade area that currently exists from the Russian border to Iceland, to use his words. I understand exactly what that is. There is free trade. There are goods that can pass between countries without tariffs. That is not the single market. It is nothing like the single market. What I've talked about, where the investment banks and the insurance companies are able to operate throughout the whole of the European Union on the basis of being authorised and regulated in Britain and from their staff in London. I've given the JP Morgan figures, of 90% or whatever of their European staff are in London. That is not on the table from the free trade option, nice as it would be if it was.
Okay, thank you, Mark. Yeah, very quickly.
No, well, the question that was put was, I think the implication was, would it be able to get access to this single market without having to make a budget contribution and without having to accept open borders? And the argument that is behind that is the situation in which Norway and Switzerland have found themselves, I don't accept for 1 minute that Britain couldn't get a completely different deal. Switzerland and Norway have chosen to pay into the EU certain amounts in exchange for participation in certain programs, like the development of the Balkans, which Switzerland decided to pay into. I don't see also why we shouldn't get a completely different approach to immigration. Let me say, I think obviously we need a degree of immigration into this country, but I think we ought to be able to have control of it. And to make a parallel between a country of 6 million people and a country of 60 million people in a bargaining position, in a negotiation, I think is a false comparison. I think we could get a better deal, an entirely different situation. There is no logic that says because you have free trade, you have to have free movement of labour. That doesn't apply in NAFTA, it doesn't apply in other free trade agreements, and there's no reason why it should here.
Thank you very much. Okay, one final question. Yeah, if I can come there. And I'll take both of these. We'll take them both together. Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Jessica Mutton. I'm from Baker & McKenzie. And my question's for those who are against the motion. Everyone talks about the UK being one of the 5th largest economies and being such an important financial centre. But do you not think that this is because we are part of the EU that we have this status? And that if we leave, we'll actually be putting ourselves at a significant disadvantage, especially when you consider that the EU will soon be able to benefit of tariff-free trade with the US as a result of TTIP, which we wouldn't be able to be a part of should we leave the EU.
It's our economic status is being argued is because we are part of the European Union. Go ahead, Eric.
Well, I'd simply say that if you look at the other global financial centres, and for example Singapore, it isn't part of anything like what the European Union is. If they can do it, I don't really understand why we can't do it, given that we have all the advantages that they have.
Okay. You want to say a very quick comment?
Well, the one point I'd make is if we were able to negotiate our own free trade agreements, we could do it to cover financial services. Because they're negotiated by the EU, as with Canada, they don't bother to cover financial services.
Okay, let's take a final question then.
Jonathan Sherrill, Eugen Law. This is a question really for those voting for the motion. You made a big deal of the fact that if we left the EU, that the banks would flee London and lose lots of jobs. The question really is that HSBC knew about the referendum last year, made a whole review about whether they needed to remain in London or move their centre away from London. Why is it they decided before the referendum that they were actually going to stay in London?
Go ahead, Mark. That's a good point, right?
May I say I did not use the word flee. None of the banks have said flee. I said very carefully that over time, if they couldn't do what they're currently doing in London, they would need to do it somewhere else. I think this use of emotive language does not help. On HSBC, the words HSBC, for those who don't know, stands for Hong Kong, Shanghai. They review their location every 5 years. They've done it over many years. For some reason, this got massive publicity this year. I think one of the main factors that would have pushed them away was not nasty EU regulation, but actually the bank levy, which had a massive adverse effect on HSBC. And when that was changed, that was a significant factor. But what HSBC have said very publicly, that if Britain was outside the EU, then the business that is currently done in Europe by HSBC would have to be done somewhere else. That is what the single market's all about. And they gave a figure, which I think was 1,000 bankers, actually going to Paris because that's where their biggest European operation is.
All right. I'm gonna stop us there. I'm gonna be even stricter about this time now because I've got a wary eye on our clock. 1.5 minutes max to each of you to make your concluding statements, and we'll do this in the reverse order. Lord Lamont, why don't you go first, please?
Well, I'm not sure I can add anything to what I've said already. All I'd say is, don't believe it's like living in the Soviet Union, I'm beginning to feel, the amount of propaganda that's descending upon us, the sort of terrible analysis we had from the government yesterday. Don't believe that plagues, locusts, disease, famine are going to descend upon us. Life is not going to be like that. We were asked the question, were we misled? I would ask you, when considering the question, and do please consider not just money, but democracy in this. Time and time again, the EU has shown its contempt of public opinion, ignoring a referendum, then asking for a second one or another one until they get the right result. Mr. Raymond Barre, the former Prime Minister of France, once said, "I can't see why public opinion has anything to do with European issues." Giscard d'Estaing and Juncker have both together said, if you get the wrong result in a referendum, we must go on until we get the right one. This is a political construction which in the end will end in disaster.
Let me just very quickly ask you, actually, I'm sorry I'm breaking the rules here, but did you hear the Commission President Jean-Claude Juncker today when he stood up and he admitted the EU interferes too much in people's lives?
That's the best thing he's ever said. Surprise,
Do you believe it?
Surprise, 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 it's in the middle of the referendum.
Right, Rhodri.
I'll just touch on 4 things. First of all, the wider economy, the issue raised here. I haven't even touched on it yet. But if you want chaos, think about what will happen to our telecoms industry, our competition law, our medicines regulation, where we have the European Medicines Agency very close to here. It will be an absolute shambles, and I have not touched on that at all. Politically, I understand what Norman is saying, but the Nick Robinson programme also showed, going right back to the 1950s, the UK consistently underestimated the European Union member states and their willingness and capability of making this work. And we should not underestimate the will of the European Union to stick together and in particular to make the euro work. And the fact that it hasn't worked over the present timescale shouldn't be assumed that it will not work in due course. And the referendum, in one sense, is being chosen at a very favourable time for the Brexiters. On the 5th largest economy in the world, look at the numbers very carefully and look at the top 3. They are the EU, the US, and China. Each of them is 4 or 5 times larger than the UK, and even Japan is twice as large. And when you look at the 4th, 6th, and 8th, they are France, Germany, and Italy. So good luck with negotiating with them. I think I'll probably stop there. The only point I was going to make is, if you think the trade negotiations are going to be successful, imagine Ian Duncan Smith, Chris Grayling, Boris Johnson, and Michael Gove in charge of them, and then worry.
All right. Thank you, Rhodri. Eric, Phillips, you're up next.
I'm an optimist. I believe that London's best days are ahead of it. I believe that London is better placed than anywhere in the world to be the world's preeminent financial centre for the foreseeable future. But to do this properly, we must be open to business, not just to the European Union, but to the whole world. And to do this properly, we must take back control of the regulation of the financial services ourselves, because the European Union is not just a single market governing the relations between the EU member states among themselves, it is also a customs union governing relations with the rest of the world. That puts limits on us which are unnecessary.
Okay. Thank you very much indeed, Eric. And finally, Mark Boleat.
I better say a word about democracy, as Norman says we haven't talked about democracy.
Last thing you're going to mention.
I'm all in favour of democracy. Right, next subject. Thank you, Norman. Come on, we live in a global world. On everything you have to trade. You know, if you want to benefit from being part of a big community, you've got to come to common agreements. We accept the rules of the Eurovision Song Contest every year so we can participate in it and get null point. We accept the rules of football and we get Arsene Wenger. You know, come on, we've got to be real about this. We can be like North Korea, you know, and make our own rules and do what we like. But nobody else can do that. Not Switzerland, not even Panama. No country in the world, if it wants to have the benefits of trading with the rest of the world, can say, we'll do our own thing, we don't care about the rest of the world. Anyway, enough on that. So democracy, you know, it's our fault if we're not as effective as we should be in the European Union. And finally, free trade agreements. We are party through the European Union to 50 with 20 more on the go. They take on average 7 years. We haven't negotiated one for 40 years. We've been insulting the European Union. Who really thinks we're going to get all of this done in 2 years? Be real.
All right. Mark, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Thank you very much to all of our debaters tonight. That was as lively as I wanted it to be, which is good. Now, look, I want to invite you to make your final votes now. And as you do that, before we grab a drink, let me mention just a couple of things. Do watch out for details of the next two debates. Right now we're looking at rights to strike as one of those, and AI and the law as another. Plenty, of course, has been said on that subject. I'd also encourage you to fill out the feedback forms outside. That's always very helpful in helping us shape future discussions. Right, let's put the final vote up. Let me just quickly remind you where we were at the start. 67, I think it was, for or thereabouts. 17 against, and undecideds on 16. So the undecideds have shifted, and they have... We're moving around a little bit. The yeses are on around 70, 72. The noes have jumped up to 21, so you've both pulled some undecideds in. But I think it's pretty fair to say the motion this evening is carried. Thank you very much to all of our debaters. Thank you to you for your questions. We kept it lively, which is what I wanted to do. Let's go grab a glass of wine. Thank you very much.